Welcome to G-Man Gaming and Reviews. Alright, so this is going to be a general discussion on the character classes. So, there are 9 classes in this game, at least that I've uncovered so far. There doesn't appear to be any more room on the screen for the others. Now, the way that it works with classes is that there are 3 factions that a class will fit into, and all the cards in the same faction, all the classes that are in the same faction will have the same deck of cards. What separates each of the individual classes in that faction, though, are their passive skills and their ultimate, right? That's what makes them different from the others. So if we have a look at the Weird Hunter, which is the very first class that you start with, faction is the Children of Morrigan. It tells you base HP, base damage. It tells you about the class. Now, what's important is the ultimate ability and the passive skill that they start with. Now, for some, the passive skill does more than others. So, essentially, the faction, the Children of Morrigan, which I'm going to call the Warriors, which is these 3 classes here, they comprise the faction. Now, like I said, each class in a faction uses the same deck of cards. It's just, like I said, the passives that are different. Alright, so you've got the Children of Morrigan, which are I will call them the Warriors. You've got the Moonrin faction, such as the Blood Mage, which is the Summoners, which is these 3 classes here. That's what I call them. And then we've got these 3, which I will call the Archers. Now, we'll start with the Warrior faction first. Now, some of the things that are unique about the Warrior faction in general is they have block. Now, there'll be certain cards in the deck that do at least 1 block, but then there are some that do more. Now, the way that block works and what makes it unique with this faction is the other 3 factions don't have block normally, with the exception of the Necromancer, who can get it as part of his ultimate ability. But for the most part, block is unique to the Warrior faction. Now, the way that block works is that block will negate 1 instance of a damage, irrespective of how high damage it is. But it only negates 1 instance. So if you play 1 block card and there's 3 attacks by multiple enemies, the block card will only block 1 instance of those attacks. And normally you can't choose which one it blocks. I think the way that it works is that the enemies attack from left to right. So if you have 1 block and there's 2 enemies, and the enemy on the left has 2 attacks and the enemy on the right has 1, it'll block one of the enemy on the left, I'm pretty certain. So that's pretty unique to the Warrior class. The other classes, like I said, don't have block. The other classes do have abilities to mitigate damage, which I will go through, but we'll stay with the Warrior classes for now. Now that we've got the Warrior classes, if we have a look at the cards, you'll see here that there are 2, like you've obviously got cards that, some of them that stun. Now, stun is available to the other classes, and what stun does is it completely stops an enemy from doing an action. This is useful to play if, say, an enemy is going to attack 10 times and you don't have 10 block. And then you've got like cards which... Now, one of the things that's not unique to the Warriors is they also have cards that reduce the damage of enemy or improve armor. Now, there are times when you're using the Warriors that improving armor is better than using blocks. And generally what that is that in this game, there are generally potentially 2 types of attack patterns when an enemy is attacking you. They're either going to do a single instance of damage, which could be to 1 character or to all targets, which only comes in play if you're using the summoners. Or you'll have enemies doing lots of instances of damage. So they'll be attacking like multiple times. Normally with weaker damage than with the one attack, right? So in the instances where you're being attacked by enemies that are using lots of weaker attacks, you want to buff armor, right? Unless you can block them all, you want to buff armor. That's your best option, right? But if the enemies that are attacking you are using fewer attacks, you want to block. Okay? So that's how generally it works. Now, some classes would prefer not to buff armor because I'll get into that into the individual classes, but that's essentially how the warrior faction works. Now, like I said, each of the warrior faction will go through each of these individual characters, but we'll go through them in more detail. They will all have their own individual guides. So the Weird Hunter is the one that you start off with, and he's all about doing damage. His ultimate ability charges every time he attacks an enemy, right? And it has a maximum of 20 charges, and the more you fill it up, the more it will do a single instance of 1 damage. Now, this can really stack up depending on the passives that you've got with the Weird Hunter. Now, his passive skill that he starts off with, which is probably the least, I suppose you could say the least, you don't really worry about this passive when you're playing the game with him. Can be useful, but for the most part, every hit you deal leaves a hunter mark, and 4 hunter marks makes enemy vulnerable. What that means is that after you deal 4 hits to an enemy, the next hit that hits them is going to do 100% more damage. So that's the Weird Hunter. Pretty straightforward, but I have done, like, when I first used this class, like, I have to admit, I have a love of the summoner classes. They're my bread and butter, but I have used this, like, for instance, I've used this class to do 1,000 points of, almost 1,000 points of damage to a boss character, which I never done that much damage with any of the other classes. So that's the Weird Hunter. Next we have the Pathfinder. Now the Pathfinder is pretty interesting in that he's got his ultimate ability gains charges based on how many stance cards he uses in a turn. So every time he uses a stance card, which blocks our stance cards, he'll charge up. Now, it has a maximum of 12 charges. For every 3 charges, you get 1 extra card, and for every 6 charges, you get 1 energy. So if you use it at maximum charge, which is 12, you'll get 4 cards and an extra 2 energy. Now, this character is all about not taking damage. And if he doesn't take damage, now what focused means is that for every turn that he doesn't take damage, his base damage stacks by 50, which means if he keeps not taking damage, he can start doing a tremendous amount of regular damage as the turn goes by. Next we have the Berserker. Now, the Berserker's passive skill is when he's below 50 HP, he gains 1 energy. His ultimate ability is what makes him different. Now, the Berserker is one of the few warriors that has an ability. Now, the others can get passive skills or cards that can do it, but for the most part, the other warrior classes can't heal themselves without using items. The Berserker is different. His ultimate ability allows him to gain lifesteal, which means he will. Now, depending on how many charges he uses of it, at maximum charge, which I think is 12, when if you use the ability, he gains 100% lifesteal, which means he will get back health based on how much damage he's doing. And obviously, the less charges that there are of it, the less percentage of lifesteal you get. So this character class charges up based on how many hits he takes. So he's also got a passive ability. He's also got a card that always appears in his hand, which boosts his armor. So this character likes to take lots of little hits to charge up his ultimate ability, so that he can heal himself. next we're going to move to the summoner classes, which I tend to like. Honestly, I have actually killed myself on purpose with the necromage, with a necromancer, because I wanted to actually get to use one of the other classes. So I have to admit I have a bias towards these classes, but there's reasons for it. So if you have a look at each of these summoning classes, they actually have the choice of 3 passive skills. And basically what those passive skills are, so the summoner classes are all about summoning minions. And they use minions to attack enemies and do other things. Right? So the summoner classes, well, at least I'm pretty sure the blood mage and the necromancer, I know for certain, these classes can actually heal themselves. Which is quite unique because most of the other classes can't do it on a regular basis. Most of the other factions can't heal themselves easily. Whereas the necromancer and the blood mage can. Now, one of the things that makes these classes better for beginners is that you can start your turn with a tank like the golem, and the golem will redirect damage to himself. And the golem will stay there until he dies, or if you're playing the necromancer, until he runs out of levels, which is a few turns. So because you start with a tank every single turn, these classes are a lot easier to play as. Now the summoner classes are all about, like I said, summoning minions and buffing them, and they also have abilities to play barriers. Now the way barriers work is that it basically becomes like an additional life bar that the enemy has to go through before they can start damaging your health. So, like I said, summoners are all about summoning creatures and getting creatures to do their bidding for them. Like I said, I would say that these are the easiest ones to start off with. Obviously, you start off with the Weird Hunter, but the summoner class was the one that I initially got the furthest with. That being said, they do have some weaknesses. Now, the summoners can have weaknesses where if you're dealing with enemies that are doing very large amounts of damage, like for instance 80 damage or more, these are times when when you're playing with one of those summoners, you'll wish you had a block. So if the summoners are dealing with enemies that are doing very large amounts of damage, whether it's a single hit or a multiple hits, it can actually be it can actually be like be game ending for them, because one of the other things that can happen with the summoner is you draw a hand and you get no summons. That's really bad, because then you're going to start taking damage, and in this game it's very, very easy to die if you start taking damage. Now, that's pretty much all I have to say about the summoners, because they're pretty straightforward. They just, like it says, they get minions to do their bidding for them, and they're easier to play than the other classes because they can summon tanks. Now, the last is what I call the archers. Now, the archers have an ability to summon barriers. I did talk about barriers before with the summoner class, but the archers have abilities to summon very strong barriers. Like if we have a look at like their deck, for instance. Okay, you'll notice that so we've got like Feint that increases gain armor this turn, then gain barrier equal to 100% of your armor. Advanced Feints, gain 20 armor this turn, gain barrier equal to 100% of your armor. So, then you've got this one, draw 2 arrows and gain 30 armor. Then there's this one, which is one of my favorites, gain 75 barrier if your armor is equal to or smaller than 25. Now you'll notice that this class relies on its barriers, but it also relies on doing a lot of damage. Like you'll notice here that you've got these shot cards that do 0, that cost 0. So, like I said, the archers in particular specialize in doing very large amounts of damage, while at the same time summoning barriers to keep themselves safe. Now, like I said, one of the things that's unique about these archer characters is that when they summon barriers, no matter how high the value of the barrier is, and no matter if it doesn't get destroyed that turn, their barriers only last for 1 turn. So, and their barriers are based on the amount of barrier that they get. For the most part, is based on their armor value. So when you're playing with the archers, you want to try to get yourself as much high armor as possible, especially using runes to do that, so that your barriers are more powerful. Now, the other thing about the archers is that a lot of their regular attacks cost 0, so they can do large quantities of damage very often, and any cards that buff their ability to do damage, which they do have a few, are really, really useful for them. So this was our rundown of the general guide to the classes of and the factions of Tainted Grail Conquest. Next, I will be moving on to guides to all the individual characters. So this was G-Man Gaming and Reviews. If you're listening to this on the podcast, please like and subscribe. No, sorry, if you're listening to the podcast, please rate it 5 stars and subscribe. And if you're watching it on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Alright, this is G-Man Gaming and Reviews. Thanks for watching.